Welcome back to part 2 on the Red Couch with Josh Aronson. It's incredible. I mean, you've done a movie about this incredible man who's a humanitarian, a hero, just a fascinating person, and yet you never met him, right?
And he died in 1947.
Right. But if you could ask him, if he could come back, if you could have asked him a question, what would you want to ask of him?
Well, there's so many questions. I spent 3 years, becoming intimate with his way of thinking.
Right.
I read thousands of his letters. There's many, many things I'd ask him. I guess one, I would ask him how did he overcome the abuse of his childhood to have the wherewithal and the personal strength to step outside of the career that had been set up for him. It was a highly lucrative career.
Right.
And how did he have the awareness as someone in his 20s to stop doing that and to educate himself? How did you see the need for that? In a way, I know the answer, because World War I was so devastating, and he was in Europe after World War I.
Right.
He was touring. He saw Warsaw, and he saw Berlin, and he saw what the result of World War I was. And he saw it on people's faces. He saw it in hospitals, played in hospitals, and he couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand how human beings could behave this way to other human beings. Why was there this war? It was so devastating to him that it motivated him to become educated, to find out something more about human beings that he knew.
Right.
But I'd certainly ask him about that.
Yeah.
And then I'd ask him, when he finally became a Zionist, which was 1933, what were the influences that made him want to do that, and how did he make that transition? Because like a lot of Jews in the early 30s, he was not a Zionist, he was anti-Zionist. He didn't see the need for a state, an Israeli state, and why in the Middle East, surrounded by Arabs. It was Einstein that actually convinced him, because when Einstein became a Zionist, they were friends, and Einstein said to him, National Socialism is coming, this anti-Semitism in Europe is getting worse and worse, the Jews need a place.
Right.
And Einstein convinced him of that. So I'd ask him about those things.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there was so much research involved, years of research. And how did you decide? I mean, you have to figure out how you're going to orchestrate this whole documentary.
Yes.
How did you decide to combine the archival material with the modern acting, which actually I loved? It helped me a lot to see, because my mind doesn't work that well. I have to see acting, I have to see something visual to help me feel like I was there.
Right, sure. Well, as a filmmaker, I had made for a decade, I've been making cinema verite films, which means I've been going into a setting with real live people, and I know where to point the camera because there's people, and I can shoot the stories of the people.
Right.
And then a year later, we'll go in the editing room with 1,000 hours of footage, and we'll find the story. This was the first time I'd made a film that would be historical, that there were none of the players in the orchestra were still alive, not one.
Wow.
From the 1936 orchestra. They'd all died. So it was all going to be interviews with people who were children of those players, with experts, with musical people who knew the story and knew what was happening at the time.
Right.
Like Pinchas Zuckerman and Joshua Bell and so on. They were very connected to Israel, and they knew. And of course it helps to have some stars in your film. But it wasn't enough. And there was certainly archival footage that I could find about those times and places. But there was no real archival footage of Huberman that was useful. And there certainly was no archival footage of Toscanini, who was the first conductor of the orchestra, amazingly, which was its own story, which we can talk about if you like. But Toscanini was in Palestine for 2 weeks, getting the orchestra ready, rehearsing them, and then performing in 4 places across Palestine. There was no footage of that, amazingly. So it just seemed that I had to do recreations to be able to weave all of it together with a voiceover narrator. And finally, as a filmmaker, it was really a choice, because could I have done it with just still photographs? Yes. But I like to shoot film. And I just couldn't imagine making the whole film, of a Ken Burns style. I mean, he uses photographs very effectively and tells stories very effectively. It's just not my way of making films. I like, to use real people, and having made commercials and television for so many years, I'm very comfortable with actors. And I hadn't worked with actors in some years, and it was just a chance to sort of get my chops back and, and do something I hadn't done before. So it was a personal stretch, and it's important to do that.
I thought it was brilliant.
No, thank you.
I loved the movie so much. I don't want to give it away. But was there something that was very challenging? Like what parts were really challenging was it challenging to put those two things together? Was it challenging to...
Well, the most challenging part of the film, aside from raising the money, was the research to find the material that would ultimately become the script, because I had to write the script. And the script was based on the letters and the articles that had been written about the main characters in the film. Well, the letters were all in Polish and German.
Wow.
So there was an archive that we found in Tel Aviv where all the letters of Huberman resided. And then in Berlin, there was a lot of the material that I used in different parts of the film, in letters and as well as archives. And so I had to hire people who could speak Polish and German. And we had to go through as minimally cataloged as the archives were. We could pull out letters from one character to another that I felt would be important. And how did I make those decisions? Purely instinct. It was just, the more I read, the more I understood this character. The more I read, the more I understood the times. I knew what the beginning and the middle and the end of the story was. I had a sense of what the climax was because I had found an event that seemed like a climax. And I just started with those ideas. In fact, it ended up almost that way in the film, not quite. And so it just purely on instinct, I'd get, the translators would give me an outline of a series of letters between Huberman and Chaim Weizmann, who was at the time the president of the World Zionist Conference, and he lived in London. And I would see, outline of the letter. There was this, Huberman would write, he was having trouble getting certificates, they'd offered him these kinds of things. And then he would go off and he would talk about other things about his personal life. Well, we couldn't afford to have all of the letters translated, so I had to select the sections that I wanted translated, because you pay by the hour with translators. This is the documentary conundrum. Yeah. And we're doing this before I'd raised the money for the film, so we're financing all of this. So I had to be very, very careful with translators in Tel Aviv and Berlin, and ultimately in Warsaw as well, where there were more letters. And I would say, do this, do this, do this, and then they would give me a more detailed translation. Then I would take those letters, now imagine what I just described, for a year in those 3 cities. And the letters would come in, and the articles would come in, and I would go through them carefully, and I would take pieces of the translations and put them in what became a growing chronological story. And I would just take pieces and I would stick them in. And then I would get ideas about things and I would write them in. And then I would see that there was a hole here. How do I get the story from this point to that point? And suddenly I'd find a letter that would fill that in. Or I'd do an interview with someone who knew about that, because I had a list of things that I would talk to all the characters about, the interviewees. Right. And then I would try to get them. Often I would say, do you know anything about the difficulty of getting certificates of entry into Palestine that Huberman experienced? And they would go, oh, I know nothing about that. Next. Yeah. So I would always ask these questions looking for the information, because it's much better to have someone you're interviewing tell you these things rather than have a voiceover narrator. I wanted as minimal voiceover narration as possible. Yeah. So that was part of the process that was difficult. And then in that process, when I was reading, I would find things that jumped out as possible recreations. That just seemed, some of them were funny, some of them were nice. I always look for humor, especially in a Holocaust era film. You need humor to keep it moving, right? So, for instance, I discovered a character called Horst Salomon, who was the first chair French horn player. And as I was reading about him and reading people who'd written about him, he was also a weightlifter. He was the first chair horn player in the Berlin Philharmonic. Then he was fired as a Jew, or he left as a Jew, and he became a horn player in another orchestra called the Kulturbund Orchestra, which was the Jewish orchestra in Palestine, in Germany at that time. But he was a weightlifter, and he was a wrestler. So mind-boggling, you don't think of Jewish musicians as also being weightlifters. Well, in the 1936 Olympics, he was invited to join the German Olympic team. But because he was Jewish, and they found out he was Jewish, he was thrown out. So he hated, he was so offended by that when Huberman approached him, it was his reason for going. Well, so that became a scene, and then when, he talked about his teaching, and he used to take his kids, his students in Palestine, he used to take them to the beach and play medicine ball with them, big heavy medicine balls, to build their chest muscles, which you need as a French horn player. And there were funny anecdotes that he used to scream at them all the time, get tougher, get tougher, get tougher. And he said, if you can't play this game, if you're not tough enough for this, you should become a pianist. I'm a pianist. They're saying pianists are wimps, you know, they don't have the chest muscles. So, okay, that's funny, and it's an easy scene to stage, and it's cheap. You know, we didn't have a big budget, so we could put people in period bathing suits and take them to the beach. And
Yeah, that was really cute.
so that's how
clever.
that scene came about. So assembling all that material into a script was really the hardest part of the film.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's incredible. It was so well done,
Well, thank you.
well orchestrated.
Well, thank you very much.
So what is next for you? Like, what do you have plans? Do you have an idea? Do you have another project?
I do. There's another film I've been, as I said, I marinate them, and I've been working on it for a while. It's a combination of several different kinds of films several different films that I've been thinking about for a long time. I've thought about doing a film about amateurism in music, about this, you know, how amateurs are so important in music and always have been. Something I've been thinking about, and I thought about making a film about a number of different things sort of around music and around people doing things. I like the idea of the zone, you know, like sports figures are in the zone, and after doing something for so many years, you know, you play basketball, and every now and then you get out there and you just can't miss. And they talk about being in the zone that day.
Right.
So I was interested in that, and just it all came together when I read a book by Oliver Sacks called Musicophilia, which is about the neurology of the brain as it relates to music, and how music impacts us, and how we take music in, and how different people take music in differently. And I'm married to a classical violinist, and I see how we respond to music differently. She's trained, and she has perfect pitch, and she's got a perfect ear, and she hears music in a way that is completely different than the way I do, or most people do, I think, because she's so trained and she has a perfect ear. She can hear the structure of music, and we'd go to a concert together, and I would be distracted, my mind would be wandering all over the place, and then I'd come back and I'd listen, and I'd try to stay focused, and I want to take Ritalin to stay focused. I mean, really have to work at it sometimes, much as I love music. She would go to a concert and she would be right there,
Right.
the whole time. And I started asking her what it was like for her to listen to music, and I realized her experience of music was like my experience of words. So if I went to a place and a person was on stage in a chair reading me a story,
Yeah.
I would stay with it, because
Right.
it's a narrative. So I can stay with the narrative, and my mind will stay. That's left brain, that's words, and that's story, and that's conceptual stuff. And so my left left side is much more developed than my right side. Music is right side.
Right.
When Maria goes, she would have the same experience with music that I did with a narrative story.
That's good.
And it turned out music is narrative for her, because she can hear the themes, she can hear how the composer is turning things upside down and doing different things with the music. Whether it's
Wow.
jazz or classical, it's the sort of same experience. And so that interested me, that we all hear different music. Music has, there's something called synesthesia, which some people have, which they have, and autistic children have this sometimes, where they hear senses and they can't quite distinguish between senses. They can't tell where things are coming from. Is it smell? Is it hearing? Is it sight? And there's too many things coming from all the different senses, and that's why autistic children sort of freak out, when there's too much noise or there's too much thing. But that's really all about sensory perception. And the idea now is, where's normal? Because they're just different. And what comes out of them, what comes back from autistic children or people with Asperger's, is diversity. So there's the spectrum of normal, and where's the line of normal?
Right.
Our line, what we call normal, might be boring
Right.
compared to what their experience is. No. And so their experience of music is different as well. So and one of the things of synesthesia is that they, when you hear music, you see color at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And there's people who have that.
Yeah,
and they
that's
live
really,
with it.
really
And they don't
neat.
even know that other people don't.
Right.
It's just a sense. It's like another sense for them. And they say, for people, Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist who writes about these things, says that sometimes when people have a brain injury, head injury, and it alters some of the cognitive abilities they have, they lose that ability. And people say it's like losing a sense all of a sudden,
Wow.
that they know when they hear music, they don't see color anymore. Well, that interested me. What is that like? I mean, I have no idea what that's like. So I want to do a film that's about those kinds of things related to music.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I mean,
So-
you've done so many fascinating, very huge variety
I know.
of topics.
Yeah.
So in your whole experience of life, if you could share a secret to living a happy and successful life, what would it be?
Share a secret. I don't think it's a secret. I think it's just people who discover this, along the way. Is simply, I have a friend who he died recently. He was 103 when he died. And when I'd see him, I'd go up to him, and his name was Mortimer. And I'd say, Mortimer, how are you? And he'd slowly turn to me, Josh, I'll tell you. And I remembered, because he always said the same thing, but it's something to remember. He said, every day I wake up is a holiday. And that was a message that somehow got into me. I was much younger. I wasn't 103. I was in my 50s at the time. But I don't live that way. I have always lived as most people under 50 live, like you'll live forever. And I just kind of made a mental note, and more as I get older, that I just really want to make sure that I'm using my time. I wake up in the morning, what are you doing today? Enjoy it, enjoy the moment, be here in the moment. And if it's not happening for you, if you can, change it. Do something else. And you're not... I interviewed Philip Glass recently for this new film. And Philip told me he has young children. He's 76 years old, but he has young children, which is a different story. He's had 5 wives.
Wow.
And he said he's a Buddhist. And he said his guru, he has a close relationship. And he asked him when he had a child, the latest child, he said, do you have any advice for me about raising children? And the guru said, let me think about it. He thought. He said, not much. He said 2 things. Let's see if I can remember them. He said, the first is, as a parent, to try and give a couple of good examples. Just try to give a couple of good examples. And the second is just always remember that your child's fate is not yours. Or your child's karma is not yours. That, it's a person and their soul is going to take them in a different way. And so, and the message is for all of us, that's true. And, you're not doing it for your parents, you're not doing it for anybody else, you're living your life, and you better get past your parents, and you better get past all the things that defined you, and just live your own life.
Well, you're doing a remarkable job, and you've done such really important work. I'm so grateful that you came, and I appreciate your being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us
On the red couch.